Sophie loved, hoped, waited. But on the day of her wedding, everything changed forever. A cold evening wrapped the city streets in its embrace. The soft glow of streetlights spilled onto the wet pavement, making it shimmer with 1,000 tiny lights. The wind played with brittle leaves, rustling under the footsteps of the few passers-by. Somewhere in the distance, a lone siren wailed long and haunting. In one of the old apartment buildings on the 3rd floor, a dim light flickered in the window. Sophie sat by the window, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the curtain. Pain mixed with despair was frozen in her eyes. Anxiety pressed against her chest, her throat tightening with rising fear. She was afraid of the future that had already been decided for her. "You won't leave me, will you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of unshed tears. She searched his eyes for hope, for salvation, but she was terrified of finding fear and hesitation instead. Andrew sat across from her, his fingers locked together, his lips pressed into a thin line. His gaze darted around the room as if searching for an escape. He looked tense, and though he tried to appear calm, his eyes betrayed the storm within: anger, helplessness, pain. "Sophie, you know I'd do anything for you." His voice was low, rough, as if each word was being torn from his throat. "Then do something." There was desperation in her voice, raw and piercing. She lifted her hands as if trying to hold on to him, to freeze this moment, to make him decide. Her lips trembled and tears rolled down her cheeks. "Take me away. Do something. I can't marry him. I love you." Andrew took a shaky breath, his fists clenching, then slowly relaxing. He wanted to just take her hand and run, to hide her away from the world, from the people who had stolen her choice. But reality wasn't that simple. Her parents had already made the decision, had sealed her fate without ever asking what she wanted. "Is this what you want?" His voice was quiet, careful. "No." Her cry cut through the air. "It's their choice. No one asked me. They just told me it was happening. They don't care what I want." Andrew closed his eyes for a brief moment, but it was enough for the pain to pierce his chest, sharp and unforgiving. He loved her. Deeply. Desperately. But what could he do? Fighting her family was like waging war against a faceless, merciless force. He was just one man, and they were an unbreakable wall. "Sophie." He ran his hand gently across her tear-streaked face, feeling the damp trails her sorrow had left behind. Her trembling seeped into him, their fears intertwining. "I don't know how. Come for me. On the day of the wedding." She grabbed his hand, gripping it tightly as if afraid he would vanish. "If you love me, if you really can't live without me, just come. Take me away. I'll go with you. Anywhere. I don't want this life without you. I can't." Her lips trembled, her breath hitched, and her heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo in the silence of the night. In that moment, she wasn't just hoping. She was clinging to her last chance at freedom. Andrew tightened his grip around her hand, firm, almost painful, as if sealing an unspoken vow. In that moment, the world shrank to just 2 points, him and her. Nothing else existed. Only their love, and the fear of losing it. Their fate hung by a thread, waiting for a single choice. "Okay," he whispered, locking eyes with her pleading gaze. "I'll come." A weak smile broke through her tears, but her hands still trembled. This was her only sliver of hope, a faint light in the suffocating darkness. But deep down, a question still lingered in her heart. Would they make it? Would he be there in time? The night stretched endlessly, unraveling in agonizing anticipation. Sophie lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to her own breathing, too loud in the silence of the room. With every heartbeat, pain echoed in her chest, and Andrew's words replayed in her mind over and over again. "I'll come." 3 simple words. They were her last hope, the only thread tying her to the dream of escape. But they also carried a terrifying possibility. What if he didn't come? What if she was left alone? A sudden knock at the door made her flinch, tearing her from her restless thoughts. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. For one brief, reckless moment, hope flared inside her. What if it was Andrew? What if he was already here? Had he come to take her away from this nightmare? But reality was far crueler. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet but tense. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the familiar figure of her mother. The woman's face was cold, carved from stone unreadable. She stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, devoid of doubt. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Tomorrow is an important day," she said evenly, her voice devoid of warmth. She didn't even look at her daughter. Sophie clenched her fists, her nails digging painfully into her palms. Anger and helplessness tangled inside her like a noose around her throat. She wanted to scream, but she knew her voice would only disappear into the void. "For who?" Her voice cracked, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. "For me? Or for you and Father?" A suffocating silence settled between them. Her mother exhaled slowly, running her fingertips along the smooth silk of the bedspread, as if studying its texture, weighing her words. And then, in a voice calm and unwavering, she spoke. "You will become the wife of a respectable man. You should be proud." "I would be, if it were my choice." Sophie's throat tightened, and she struggled to hold back tears. "But this is a cage. A beautiful gilded cage, but still a cage." For the briefest second, her mother's gaze wavered. A flicker of something, regret, maybe? Or was Sophie just desperate to see a sliver of understanding in her? "We did what is right." Her mother's voice was quiet, yet there was something ominous in that quietness. "Tomorrow a new life awaits you. You do well to accept it." She stood, her shadow stretching across the walls before vanishing through the doorway, leaving behind nothing but cold, crushing silence. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the blanket in her fists, fighting against the scream clawing its way up her throat. Tomorrow everything would be decided. Tomorrow Andrew had to come. Tomorrow either freedom or a lifetime of captivity. She tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts churned in relentless circles, caught in the ruthless storm between fear and hope, between despair and blind faith in a miracle. Morning came too quickly. Sophie hadn't even noticed when the night dissolved into the soft, gray light of dawn. She hadn't slept, she couldn't. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but her mind was too tense, too wound up to allow even a moment of rest. Another knock on the door. Sharper this time, more insistent. Sophie clenched her hands into fists, took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Maybe if she pretended she wasn't there, everything would just disappear. "Sophie, get up." Her father's voice was flat, hollow, devoid of warmth. Just an order. "It's time." She didn't answer, just rose from the bed and looked at herself in the mirror. Pale face, dark circles under her eyes, a gaze frozen in despair. That wasn't her reflection. That was someone else. A girl she never wanted to be. Footsteps faded down the hallway. He wasn't waiting. Sophie knew. Her time was running out. Today, everything would be decided. Today, either Andrew would save her, or she would be trapped in this gilded cage forever. She opened the closet and ran her fingers over the wedding dress. It was beautiful. Exquisite fabric, intricate embroidery, the finest lace. But to her, it wasn't a symbol of happiness. It was a symbol of her captivity, her defeat. She gripped the fabric tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. What if Andrew didn't come? What if he forgot? What if he lost his nerve? Thoughts crashed over her like waves, each one worse than the last, drowning her in fear. She stepped to the window and looked outside. Everything was the same. People rushing about their day, cars passing by. The world kept moving forward, completely unaware that inside her, everything was falling apart. A knock at the door pulled her back to reality. "Sophie, are you ready?" Her mother's voice this time. Calm, steady, and somehow that made it even more terrifying. Sophie closed her eyes, gathered every ounce of strength she had left, and finally answered, "Yes." But in her heart there was only one hope, that he would come. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The white dress fit her perfectly, accentuating the delicate lines of her figure. But there was no joy in her eyes, only emptiness. Emptiness laced with despair. Her fingers trembled as they traced the delicate lace at the hem, her breath uneven, caught in the grip of overwhelming anxiety. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but her heart clenched inside her chest, warning her, whispering of the disaster ahead. Outside the room, voices echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls. Guests had already started gathering. Laughter, hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses. All of it blended into a distant, meaningless hum. The ceremony was about to begin. Her heartbeat was so loud it felt like the whole house could hear it. "Sophie, darling." Her mother's voice came from the door. "We're waiting for you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took one last look at herself in the mirror and drew in a slow, deep breath, as if bracing for the final step. She knew Andrew had promised to come. But what if? What if he didn't make it? What if he never came at all? The thought sliced through her mind like a blade, sharp and relentless, leaving no room for peace. The door creaked open slightly, and her mother peered inside. Her gaze was stern, unreadable. But for the briefest moment, Sophie thought she saw something else. A flicker of concern, a shadow of doubt. It was gone in an instant. "Sophie," her mother repeated, quieter now, laced with impatience. "I'm coming." Her voice was even, too even, but inside she was trembling. She took a step toward the door, her legs unsteady beneath her. The world around her felt wrong, like it wasn't hers, like this was happening to someone else. The walls of the room she had grown up in suddenly felt small, like a cage closing in, leaving her no way out. In the hallway, her father was waiting. His face was impassive, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something heavy, something Sophie couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Or just exhaustion from this whole ordeal? "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, but the words stuck in her throat. Was she really ready? Step by step, she descended the staircase, feeling the weight of countless eyes on her. The guests were already watching, whispering, smiling, judging. Time slowed. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of her footsteps. And in her mind, there was only one thought. Where is Andrew? When they stepped outside, she saw the cars waiting. Everything was going according to plan. Everything, except for one thing. He wasn't there. She froze. Her eyes swept over the courtyard, searching, scanning, hoping. The sun was too bright. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but none of it mattered. Her world had narrowed to a single point, waiting. People were talking, laughing, admiring her. But none of them existed. Her gaze sought only one face. One person. Andrew. But he wasn't there. Was he really not coming? Time moved painfully slow, stretching into a thick, suffocating stream of uncertainty and dread. Sophie stood frozen, her legs numb, as if they no longer obeyed her will. Her breath was unsteady, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven motions. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain everyone around her could hear it. The world blurred, colors faded, sounds melted into a distant, indistinct hum, as if someone had turned down the volume on reality. Nothing else mattered. Where was Andrew? "Sophie, let's go." Her father's hand pressed gently yet firmly against her elbow, grounding her back to the moment. His voice was calm, controlled. But beneath that calm, there was something else. A flicker of impatience. "It's time." She didn't move, didn't respond. Instead, she cast one last desperate glance around the courtyard, searching for him. Hoping. Maybe he was running late. Maybe something had happened. Maybe. Her mind spiraled, grasping at any explanation. But none of them brought relief. The longer she stood there, the tighter the walls closed in around her, trapping her, sealing off every way out. "Sophie!" Her mother's voice cut through the air, sharper now, laced with irritation. "Everyone is waiting." She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to swallow the rising panic. Her fingers clenched the delicate fabric of her dress, as if she could find strength in its fragile lace. Andrew had promised. He said he would come. He wouldn't leave her. A car door creaked open. Laughter floated through the air. Glasses clinked. The guests were lost in their own world, in their conversations, their celebrations. Some posed for photos. Others adjusted their outfits, oblivious to the silent war raging inside her. Sophie felt like she was drowning. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the hem of her dress, forcing herself to take a step forward. One step, then another, each one heavier than the last, as if an invisible force was trying to hold her back. She turned one final time, looking over her shoulder, her eyes locked on the road. Her heart clenched, waiting. But there was nothing. No dust rising in the distance. No sound of an approaching engine. No familiar figure rushing toward her. Only emptiness. The hum of voices blurred into a single suffocating noise, pressing down on Sophie like a heavy, unyielding weight. She caught fragments of conversations, bursts of laughter. Someone adjusting the flower arrangements. Someone else telling a story. Others glancing impatiently at their watches. The air was thick with excitement, the electric anticipation of celebration. But inside her, everything was different. There was no joy, no thrill. Only the creeping, paralyzing grip of panic, wrapping around her like invisible chains. She could feel the cool air brushing against her skin, but it did nothing to numb the icy void within. Her mother had already stepped forward, radiating perfect composure, as she exchanged polite words with the guests. Her father stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, watching her closely, studying her, waiting to see if she would break. "Everything is ready." His words were firm, final, like a gunshot sealing her fate. "It's time." Sophie couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, her thoughts tangled. Her heart beat a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every part of her was screaming, "Run!" But her feet refused to obey. A tightness coiled around her throat, making it hard to breathe. She could say no. She could. But could she really? "Sophie." Her mother's voice was softer now. But beneath the gentleness was something sharper. A warning. A quiet, cold authority wrapped in a thin veil of concern. "You can't be late for your own wedding. Everyone is waiting." Sophie lifted her head, locking eyes with her mother. Her gaze was unreadable, impenetrable, but her voice held the same thing as her eyes, a command disguised as kindness. Sophie clenched her hands into fists, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream, to beg, but no one would hear her. Not really. She nodded, even as everything inside her begged her not to. Her movements felt mechanical, like someone else was pulling the strings. One step, another, each one heavier than the last, each one extinguishing another flicker of hope. He wasn't here yet. He wasn't coming. And yet, her heart still waited for him, until its very last beat. Sophie stepped out of the house, the sunlight blinding her. But it didn't bring warmth. No, it felt cold, distant, as if mocking the despair twisting inside her. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, drowning out the rest of the world. The guests were already gathered, some smiling, some chatting excitedly about the ceremony. Women whispered about her dress, about how lucky she was. But no one saw the wreckage inside her. Every movement felt forced. Her steps mechanical, like she wasn't the one controlling her body anymore. A dull ringing filled her ears, the air thick and heavy, clinging to her lungs like suffocating silk. It felt like she was walking through water, like she was drowning. "Sophie, you look absolutely stunning." The voice came from somewhere close, bright and warm, but it sounded distant, like an echo from another world. A gentle hand brushed against hers. She flinched, snapping back to reality. Lifting her gaze, she met the eyes of an older woman, smiling at her with genuine kindness. Sophie tried to smile back, to force some kind of response, but her lips betrayed her, trembling with the weight of everything she couldn't say. She only nodded, silent. Her father walked beside her, tall, composed, his face set in a mask of dignity. There was pride in his eyes, satisfaction. Everything had fallen into place. This was a victory for him, an achievement. The final step in years of careful planning, strengthening alliances, securing status. For her, this was the end of hope, the end of dreams, the end of her. "Are you ready?" His voice was low, steady, a hint of tension beneath the surface. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to, because he already knew her answer. Her silence was expected. She blinked slowly, forcing down the lump in her throat, the weight of it growing heavier, tighter with every passing second. Step. Another. Faces blurred past her. Some watched with admiration. Others with quiet envy. Some beamed with joy for her supposed happiness. They saw the picture-perfect moment. A radiant bride. A dignified father. A grand celebration. They didn't see the war inside her. The heartbreak. The silent, desperate plea for a miracle. Her heart still waited. Still hoped. Her gaze flickered toward the road, searching. Clinging to every tiny movement. Every flicker of motion. Maybe he was there. Maybe he was coming. Maybe. But the road remained empty. And hope slipped further and further away. Sophie stood at the altar. Her heart pounding so violently it echoed in her temples. Her breath was shallow, restrained, as if her lungs refused to expand fully. Inside, everything twisted with pain and despair. But outside, she was flawless. Her gaze lowered. Her shoulders tense. Her lips trembled barely, but not enough to betray the storm raging within her. The guests waited in hushed anticipation. The solemn melody of the wedding march floated through the air. But in Sophie's ears, it was muted, distant, like someone had drowned it in thick, suffocating fog. Her eyes searched for something, anything to hold on to. But there was no road, no movement, no sign of him. Only faces. Happy, excited, convinced they were witnessing a beautiful love story. Perfect new beginning. They had no idea that this was a funeral, a farewell to her dreams. The groom stood beside her, tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His dark eyes held a gentle smile, but there was no passion in them, no fear, no hesitation, only certainty, the certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. Did he know? Did he know her heart belonged to someone else? Or did he simply choose to ignore it? It didn't matter. He never asked. And she could never tell. The officiant began to speak, his voice steady, rich with solemn importance. But Sophie heard none of it. The words slipped past her, vanishing into nothing. The world around her blurred, unraveling like a fading mirage. And for a moment, just a moment, she felt like she might collapse. Her fingers trembled. Her palms were damp. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes watching her, tracking every tiny movement. Sophie. Her name pulled her back. The officiant had spoken. She lifted her gaze, realizing this was it. The moment. The one that would seal her fate forever. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her throat tightened. Her breath hitched. Every part of her screamed, pleaded, begged her to stop. But she stood there, trapped, caged by expectation, unable to disobey. And then, a loud noise shattered the silence. Distant at first, like it came from outside. Then, footsteps, voices, a sharp, frantic cry. The guests gasped, some turning, some whispering in confusion. Heads swiveled toward the entrance. Sophie's heart stopped. For a single, excruciating second, everything froze. Was this it? Fate? Hope? Or just another cruel twist of destiny? Her breath became so shallow, as if she was running out of air. The last ember of hope, flickering, terrifying, and on the verge of consuming her whole. Silence blanketed the hall like a thick veil, swallowing every sound. Even the breath of the guests seemed muffled. It was as if the air itself had frozen in anticipation. Every gaze was locked onto the entrance, where the sudden noise had come from. A chill ran down Sophie's spine, and her heart pounded so violently it sent sharp, pulsing pain through her temples. She clenched the fabric of her dress, trying to hold on to reality. Time stretched unbearably, each second dragging into eternity. The groom turned toward the sound. His face remained composed, but a flicker of irritation mixed with confusion flashed in his eyes. Who would dare interrupt the ceremony? In his world, everything followed a plan. His plan. And he did not tolerate disruptions. The footsteps grew louder, steady, unwavering. Whoever was coming was afraid of nothing. A shiver rippled through Sophie. Goosebumps prickled her skin. She didn't dare turn, but every nerve in her body braced for something inevitable, something terrifying. Guests glanced at one another. Someone gasped. Whispers spread through the hall, some filled with excitement, others with discontent. "Who is that?" The hushed question echoed, as if the air itself was waiting for an answer. The officiant fell silent, his gaze lifting over the heads of the crowd. The groom stiffened, his fingers curling into a fist. Sophie struggled to stay upright, her knees weak, her breath catching in her throat. Then, no one entered. Only a gust of wind slipped through the hall, unseen but real. It brushed against the guests, rustling the delicate veil over Sophie's hair, lifting it ever so slightly, as if an unseen hand had touched it. "Sophie," a voice, so faint yet piercing, laced with pain and hope. Or had she imagined it? Her head snapped up, eyes darting around searching. But all she saw were stunned faces. No one moved. No one spoke. Her heart pounded erratically. A cold sensation crawled up her spine, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Darkness edged at her vision, but she forced herself to stay upright, fighting the panic clawing at her chest. "Andrew!" Her lips formed the name soundlessly, the mere thought of saying it out loud terrifying her. The world tilted. The walls seemed to shift, the room blurring at the edges. Her fingers went slack, and the fabric of her dress slipped from her grip. Inside, everything turned upside down. She reached for something familiar, clinging to the faces around her. But her mind refused to accept what was happening. "Sophie!" Her mother's sharp voice cut through the air, snapping her back from the brink. She turned, but she already knew. There was no one there. Only the hollow echo, ringing in her ears, merging with the thunderous rush of blood in her veins. And deep inside her, a terrible feeling took root. She didn't need words to understand. Something had happened. Something horrible. As the echo of the unknown voice dissolved into silence, Sophie felt her fingers curl into a tight fist. Her chest constricted, her breath hitched, and a chilling shiver ran down her spine. She tried to process what had just happened, but her thoughts twisted together like tangled threads, impossible to unravel. Her heart pounded too loudly, hammering out an anxious rhythm that only she could hear. The world around her remained the same, but inside everything had changed. Her chest rose and fell with effort, each breath feeling heavier. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, suffocating. The groom leaned in, his voice quiet yet firm, tinged with mild irritation. "Are you all right? You look pale." Sophie lifted her eyes to meet his, but her gaze was distant, unfocused, like she was looking straight through him. She saw his face, but it felt unfamiliar, blurred, insignificant against the storm raging inside her. Her lips trembled slightly, but she couldn't answer. Her thoughts had already left this room. Every part of her screamed, urged her run. Leave. Escape before it's too late. But her feet were rooted to the floor, bound by invisible chains. The officiant cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the ceremony. A heavy silence filled the hall. Guests watched her, some with curiosity, others with confusion, a few with faint concern. Sophie could feel their stares pressing down on her, but she couldn't make herself move. "Sophie, are you ready to continue?" The officiant's voice was gentle, laced with uncertainty. There was hesitation in his eyes, as if he sensed something had changed within her. Maybe he could see the invisible battle waging inside her soul. Slowly, Sophie nodded, but the motion felt foreign, as if it wasn't truly her who had obeyed, but someone else pulling the strings. From this moment forward, she knew her life would change forever, no matter what she did. Her fate had already been written, and she was merely following the path laid before her, a character in a story she could not rewrite. Yet still she waited. For what? An answer? A sign? A miracle? Her eyes flickered toward the doors, still closed. A painful squeeze tightened around her heart. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. Why wouldn't this feeling go away? She took a deep breath, as if stepping off the edge into the abyss, and whispered, "Yes." But deep inside, it felt as if she had just said goodbye to something important. And this farewell was irreversible. Sophie stood motionless, feeling the hollow emptiness expand inside her. Her own words, the very ones that had just left her lips, echoed in her mind. Yes, she had spoken it, but it felt like a sentence, like an invisible door had shut with a dull final click, severing her from the past, from hope, from choice. The groom smiled, confidently taking her hand. His fingers were warm, steady, but the touch sent a strange sensation through Sophie. A chilling stillness. He looked pleased, composed, as if everything was exactly as it should be. His lips moved in a whisper, perhaps gratitude, perhaps joy. But Sophie couldn't hear the words. She looked down at their joined hands, yet felt nothing. No comfort. No certainty. Only cold, numbing emptiness, spreading through her body like an emotionless tide. The guests erupted into cheerful murmurs, breaking free all at once. Someone clapped. Someone wiped away a tear of joy. Sophie's mother exhaled in quiet relief, giving her father the smallest of nods. Everything around her spun into a whirlwind of events, like a grand theater where everyone played their part. Congratulations! Beaming smiles, gentle handshakes, soft kisses on the cheek. Sophie heard words, scattered and distant, but they blurred into an incoherent hum, never truly reaching her. She felt like she was on a stage, acting in a performance, yet she was the only one who knew it wasn't real. She felt herself being led forward, step by step, across the petal-strewn carpet. Camera flashes flickered, blinding her. The surrounding crowd admired her, watching in awe. But no one noticed her struggle. No one was supposed to. She moved mechanically, offering no resistance, surrendering to what was meant to happen. The groom leaned in slightly, his lips brushing against her temple in a light, almost weightless kiss. A kiss meant to symbolize the start of a new life. "Everything is fine," he murmured, his voice steady, filled with unnerving certainty. "Now everything will be as it should." She didn't respond, only pressed her lips together, and forced herself to smile, because that was what was expected of her. But as her gaze lingered on the doors one final time, her heart faltered. Beyond them, her hope remained, the one she had waited for, the one who had promised to come. But he never did. Several months had passed. Sophie walked through the cemetery, her steps slow, careful, as if trying not to disturb the fallen leaves that crunched beneath her feet. A quiet reminder of time, mercilessly erasing the traces of the past. Her heart clenched at the memories, but today, she wasn't here to dwell on loss. She simply wanted to visit the graves of her loved ones, just as she had done so many times before. The cold wind cut against her skin, piercing through to her very bones, but she barely noticed. In her hand was a small bouquet of white lilies, the same ones she always brought to her grandmother. They symbolized purity, a bright memory, but now they felt fragile. As fragile as she did, she walked forward, taking her time, thoughtfully reading the inscriptions on the headstones, passing by strangers' stories, by lives that once laughed, loved, dreamed, now reduced to nothing more than stone. Then, her gaze caught on a grave. Something about it pulled her in. Maybe the fresh flowers carefully placed at its base. Maybe the clean, polished surface of the headstone, as if it had only recently been set. Time seemed to stop. A chill ran down her spine as she hesitated, then slowly lifted her eyes to read the inscription. A name, one she recognized immediately. Her breath caught. The date of death. It matched the day of her wedding. Her chest tightened, a sharp ringing filling her ears. For a brief moment, it felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. She couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. Her fingers trembled, clutching the stems of the flowers, but she barely noticed. Fragments of memories flooded her mind. His voice, his laughter, the warmth of his hands, the way he looked at her, his promise to come for her. He was on his way to her. He kept his promise, but fate had other plans. Sophie's legs weakened, and she slowly sank to her knees before the grave. Her chest tightened so painfully it felt like the air had turned thick, impossible to breathe. Everything inside her shattered under the unbearable weight of knowing she could never turn back time. Her throat burned. She wanted to scream, but the sound never came. Only tears, hot, heavy, slipped down her cheeks, falling onto the cold earth below. "I am sorry." Her whisper barely escaped her lips, breaking with raw emotion. I'm so sorry. The words dissolved into silence. But then, the wind rose, swirling the fallen leaves around her. A gentle breeze brushed against her face, light fleeting, as if unseen fingers had traced her cheek, just like he used to. Sophie shivered, her hands clenching tighter, an unexplainable feeling growing inside her. Something beyond logic. Something she could only feel with her soul. She closed her eyes. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to truly grieve, to let go of what could never be undone. And in that silence, she swore she heard his voice. Soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. I loved you. Always. She opened her eyes, letting the wind take away her last doubts, her sorrow. And suddenly, for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something change. The wind that had carried her tears away left behind an emptiness. But in that emptiness, there was peace. A peace where she could finally breathe. Fate often plays with our lives in ways we never expect. And some moments we understand only when it's too late. Cherish real emotions and never postpone important decisions, because we may not get a second chance to say what truly matters. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.